There are moments in life when you realize you've become invisible in your own home. Not the kind of invisibility that comes from being ignored during a busy day, but the profound erasure of someone who has given everything and received nothing but contempt in return. I'm Mariella. I'm 53 years old, and until last Tuesday afternoon, I still believed that love and sacrifice would eventually be recognized by the person who mattered most to me. The fluorescent light in our small kitchen cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor, the same floor I'd mopped 1,000 times while humming lullabies to a baby who grew into a stranger. My daughter stood before me, her hand extended with that familiar expectation, the weekly allowance that had become less a gift and more a demanded tribute. But this Tuesday, my mind had been elsewhere. My hours at the nursing home had been extended. Mrs. Patterson had passed away during my shift, and I'd held her hand as she took her last breath, whispering comfort to someone else's mother because mine had died years ago, and I knew what it meant to be alone at the end. I'd forgotten. A simple, human mistake born from exhaustion and grief. I'd forgotten to withdraw the money she expected every Tuesday at 5 o'clock. As reliable as the sunset, as predictable as my own breathing. "Mom, where's my money?" Her voice carried that edge I'd learned to recognize, the tone that preceded storms I could never quite weather, no matter how many years of practice I'd had. I looked up from the sink where I'd been washing the same plate 3 times without noticing, my hands trembling slightly from fatigue. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I forgot to go to the ATM today. Mrs. Patterson died, and—" The words died in my throat as I watched her face transform. Not into sadness or understanding, but into something colder, something that reminded me she hadn't asked about my day in months, maybe years. When had she stopped caring? When had I stopped mattering enough to warrant even basic curiosity about my life? "You forgot?" She repeated the words as if I'd committed an unforgivable sin, as if 23 years of remembering every birthday, every school event, every preference and desire she'd ever expressed counted for nothing against this single oversight. Before I could explain further, before I could reach for my purse to show her I'd get the money tomorrow, her hand moved with a speed that shocked me. She grabbed my phone from the counter, my only connection to the outside world, the device that held photos of her first steps, her kindergarten graduation, every milestone I'd documented as a single mother who had no one else to share these moments with. Time seemed to slow as I watched her raise it above her head. "What are you—" I started, but the words became meaningless as she threw it to the ground with a force that came from somewhere deep and angry, somewhere I didn't recognize. The sound of it hitting the tile was sharp, final, but she wasn't finished. With deliberate precision, she lifted her foot, wearing the expensive boots I'd worked double shifts to buy her last Christmas, and brought her heel down on the screen. Once. Twice. The cracking sound echoed in the small kitchen like breaking bones, like something vital shattering beyond repair. "Now you'll remember," she whispered, and those 3 words carried more venom than any scream could have held. I stood there, frozen, watching her walk away as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she hadn't just destroyed more than a phone. The pieces of glass on the floor reflected the kitchen light in fractured patterns, and when I finally knelt to gather them, I saw my own face in the largest shard, distorted, broken, barely recognizable. My hands moved mechanically, picking up the fragments while my mind tried to process what had just occurred. This was my daughter, the baby I'd rocked through countless nights when colic made her scream, and I had no help, no partner to share the burden. This was the child I'd homemade birthday cakes for when I couldn't afford bakery ones. The girl I'd taught to read by candlelight during power outages when I couldn't pay the electric bill on time. When had she learned to hate me? Or worse? When had she learned that I was someone who deserved this kind of treatment? I picked up the largest piece of the phone, and in its cracked screen I could barely make out the last photo I'd taken. A selfie I'd attempted last week, trying to capture something hopeful, something that said I was still here, still alive, still worth documenting. Now it was destroyed, just like so many other things I'd tried to preserve. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of 23 years of single motherhood, of sacrifices that had seemed noble at the time, but now felt like elaborate preparation for my own erasure. I'd given up the secretarial course that might have led to better jobs. I'd declined dates with kind men because she always cried when I tried to go out. I'd worked night shifts at the nursing home so I could be there for her during the day, sleeping in scattered hours that left me perpetually exhausted, but convinced it was worth it. Because wasn't that what mothers did? I pulled myself up from the floor, the broken phone cradled in my hands like the remains of something once precious. My reflection in the darkened window above the sink showed a woman I barely recognized. Gray streaks in hair I no longer had time to dye, lines around my eyes from years of smiling through difficulty, shoulders permanently hunched from the weight of carrying everything alone. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever given everything only to be treated like nothing, then you understand. If you like stories about real people facing real pain and finding their way back to dignity, please subscribe to this channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it helps us continue sharing these stories. And please, comment with which city you're watching from. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. That night, I swept up every piece of glass, each fragment representing something broken between us that I'd tried so hard to keep whole. I placed them in a small bag, not sure why I was keeping them, only knowing that throwing them away felt like admitting defeat. My daughter's door was closed, music playing loud enough that I knew she couldn't hear me even if I called out. But I didn't call out. For the first time in 23 years, I had nothing to say to her. The silence between us had finally become louder than any words I could offer. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with homework, where we'd eaten countless meals, where I'd signed permission slips and college applications and loan documents to pay for her education, and I felt something crack inside me that had nothing to do with phone screens. It was deeper, older, more fundamental. It was the sound of a mother's heart finally understanding that love alone wasn't enough to make someone see you as human. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bass from her room. I looked around at the life I'd built. Modest, practical, focused entirely on giving her opportunities I'd never had. Every choice, every sacrifice, every extra shift had been about her future. But what about mine? For the first time in decades, I asked myself a question I'd been too afraid to consider. Who was I beyond being her mother? And more terrifying still, would I even recognize myself if I tried to find out? The broken phone sat on the table before me, and in its shattered screen, I could see 1,000 fractured versions of myself, each one asking the same silent question. How much more can you take before there's nothing left to break? I didn't have an answer yet. But as I sat there in the kitchen that had witnessed so many moments of my motherhood, I felt something shifting. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was there too. It wasn't even sadness, though tears would come later. It was something quieter, more dangerous, more permanent. It was the first stirring of a woman who had forgotten she existed beyond her role as someone's mother, someone's caretaker, someone's ATM machine. And that woman, buried under years of sacrifice and silence, was beginning to remember what it felt like to matter. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, I didn't rush to fill the silence with apologies or explanations or desperate attempts to fix what was broken. I just sat there, holding the pieces, and let myself feel the weight of everything I'd carried alone. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. But something told me that tomorrow's Mariella might be different from the one who had mechanically handed over allowances and accepted disrespect as the price of a daughter's presence. Something told me that the woman picking up these broken pieces might finally be ready to put herself back together in a different pattern, one where she was visible again, even if only to herself. The kitchen light buzzed softly overhead, casting its harsh glow on a scene that would mark a turning point, though I didn't fully understand it yet. All I knew was that when my daughter had whispered, "Now you'll remember," she had been right. I would remember this moment, but perhaps not in the way she intended. The days after the phone incident passed like scenes from someone else's life, mechanical, distant, as if I were watching myself move through routines that had once felt meaningful but now seemed hollow. I bought a cheap replacement phone, the kind that came with a prepaid plan, and none of the memories my old one had carried. No photos, no messages, no digital evidence that I'd once had a life worth documenting. My daughter didn't apologize. Not that day, Not the next? Not ever. She moved through our apartment as if nothing had happened, as if destroying someone's property was just another Tuesday afternoon, as unremarkable as forgetting to buy milk or leaving dishes in the sink. Her silence on the matter was louder than any justification could have been. It told me that in her mind, I had deserved it. I found myself watching her differently now, studying her the way you might observe a stranger in a coffee shop, trying to understand how someone familiar had become so unrecognizable. When had her eyes learned to look through me instead of at me? When had my presence become background noise in her life, noticed only when I failed to provide something she wanted? She spent most of her time in her room, emerging only for meals she expected to be prepared and ready, or when she needed something, money, usually, or rides to places she deemed important. Her friends, her social life, her mysterious activities that she never explained, and I had stopped asking about years ago when my questions were met with eye rolls and exasperated sighs. "Mom, I need $70 for the concert next week," she announced one morning. Not asking, not requesting, just stating a fact as if my bank account existed solely for her entertainment. I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, her clothes mixed with mine, though I'd noticed recently that she'd started washing her own things separately, as if even our garments shouldn't touch in the washing machine. "I can't afford that right now," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the shirt I was folding. "The car needs new brakes, and—" "Seriously?" Her voice cut through my explanation like scissors through paper. "Jessica's mom gave her $100. But I guess I'm the only one with a poor mother who can't even afford a simple concert ticket." The word poor landed like a slap, not because it was untrue. I had always struggled financially, stretched every dollar until it screamed, but because of the contempt with which she said it, as if my economic situation was a personal failing rather than the result of raising a child alone while working jobs that barely covered our basic needs. "I work 40 hours a week at the nursing home," I reminded her, my voice still calm though something was building inside me, something that felt dangerously close to the edge of breaking. "I do everything I can to—" Yeah, I know. You sacrifice so much." She mimicked my voice with cruel accuracy, twisting my words into something pathetic and self-pitying. "Maybe if you'd actually done something with your life instead of just being a nurse's aide, we wouldn't be in this situation." I looked up then, really looked at her, this young woman who carried my features but none of my compassion, who had my eyes but saw the world through a lens of entitlement I'd never taught her. Where had she learned this cruelty? I'd raised her to be kind, to understand struggle, to appreciate the small victories that came from hard work and persistence. But looking at her now, I realized I'd protected her too well from the reality of our situation. I'd skipped meals to make sure she always had lunch money. I'd worn the same coat for 10 years so she could have new clothes each season. I'd created an illusion of stability that hid the constant anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, the terror of unexpected expenses, the exhaustion of choosing between medication and groceries. In protecting her from poverty, I'd somehow created a child who despised it, and by extension, despised me. "I'll see what I can do," I said finally, returning to the laundry because looking at her had become too painful. I heard her dramatic sigh, the sound of her footsteps retreating to her room, the slam of her door that had become the punctuation mark to most of our conversations. The apartment fell silent again, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful silence, the kind that comes when people are comfortable in each other's presence. This was the silence of strangers forced to share space, counting the hours until they could escape each other's company. I thought about my own mother, dead now for 15 years. She'd been tough, sometimes harsh, but never cruel. She'd worked 2 jobs to raise me and my brother, and yes, we'd been poor, but we'd understood it. We'd seen her exhaustion, witnessed her struggles, and it had made us grateful, not resentful. We'd learned to appreciate what we had because we saw what it cost her to provide it. What had I done wrong? I'd tried to do better than my mother, to give my daughter more opportunities, more comfort, more security, but somewhere in all that giving, I'd forgotten to teach her the most important lesson, that people who love you deserve respect, regardless of their bank balance. That evening, I went to my shift at Sunrise Senior Living with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The nursing home had become more than just my workplace. It was a refuge where my presence actually mattered, where the elderly residents smiled when they saw me, where my care was appreciated rather than expected and dismissed. Mrs. Chen, one of my favorite residents, noticed immediately that something was wrong. At 87, she had the kind of perception that came from decades of reading people, of understanding that what wasn't said often mattered more than what was. "Mariella, dear, you look like someone broke your heart," she said, as I helped her into her wheelchair for dinner. Her hand, thin and spotted with age, reached up to touch my cheek with surprising gentleness. I tried to smile, to maintain the professional demeanor that usually came so easily. "Just a difficult day, Mrs. Chen. Nothing to worry about." "Difficult days with family are the worst kind," she said, with the certainty of someone who'd lived long enough to know. "Because we can walk away from strangers, from jobs, from places that hurt us. But family we carry with us, even when the weight becomes unbearable." Her words struck something deep inside me, and I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "How do you know it's family?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because that's the look of a mother whose child has forgotten to love her back," Mrs. Chen said simply. "I know it because I wore it myself for many years. My son, well, let's just say some children grow up believing that what their parents give them is their birthright rather than their blessing." I wanted to ask her more, to understand how she'd survived it, but other residents needed attention, and the moment passed. Still, her words stayed with me throughout my shift, echoing in the quiet moments between tasks. When I returned home well past midnight, the apartment was dark except for the light under my daughter's door. I could hear her laughing, talking on the phone with someone who apparently deserved her joy, her animation, all the warmth she never showed me anymore. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her voice, so different from the flat, irritated tone she used with me. With her friends, she was charming, funny, engaged. With me, she was a different person entirely. Or perhaps I was simply the only one who saw her true self, the self that had learned I was safe to mistreat because I would always forgive, always provide, always be there. In my own room, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the new phone with its empty contact list and blank photo gallery. I'd had that old phone for 5 years. In its memory had been pictures of my daughter's high school graduation, her first day of college, random moments I'd captured because I still believed then that we were building memories together, that these images would someday be treasured evidence of our bond. Now I had nothing. No photos, no messages, no digital proof that I had a daughter who had once smiled at me with genuine affection before I became nothing more than an ATM machine with a disappointing withdrawal limit. I thought about Mrs. Chen's words, about carrying family even when the weight became unbearable. How much more could I carry? How much more should I carry? These questions felt dangerous, rebellious even, because mothers weren't supposed to ask them. Mothers were supposed to endure, to sacrifice, to love unconditionally even when that love was returned with contempt. But I was tired. Not just physically, though my body ached from the 12-hour shift, but tired in a deeper way. A soul-deep exhaustion that came from years of giving to someone who had learned to take without gratitude, without recognition, without even basic human kindness. The next morning, I woke to find a note on the kitchen counter, my daughter's handwriting sharp and angular, matching her personality. "Going to stay at Jessica's for a few days. Need space. Don't call. Space." She needed space from me, from the mother who had given her everything, who had sacrificed every dream and ambition to make sure she had opportunities I'd never had. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then stood in the silent apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in service to someone who couldn't even stand to be in the same space with me unless she needed something. And in that silence, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not with any grand revelation, but quietly, like the first crack in ice that's been frozen too long. I was still her mother. I still loved her. But maybe, just maybe, I needed to start remembering that I was also Mariella, a woman who existed beyond her role as someone's disappointing parent. The bonds that had held us together were breaking, fraying thread by thread. I could feel them loosening, could sense the distance growing between who I'd been and who I was becoming. And for the first time, instead of desperately trying to hold those bonds together, I wondered what might happen if I simply let them break. Maybe some things needed to fall apart before they could be rebuilt into something healthier, something that didn't require one person to disappear so the other could shine. Maybe love shouldn't feel like erasure. I made myself coffee in the quiet kitchen, sat at the table where I'd served 1,000 meals to someone who had forgotten how to say thank you, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of my loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone. I'd been alone for years, even when my daughter was in the next room, but the deeper loneliness of being unseen by the one person whose recognition I'd craved most. The morning light filtered through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air, tiny particles floating freely in the space between what had been and what might still be. And I sat there, a woman of 53 years, and began to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to let go, not of the person, but of the version of yourself that has been willing to accept so little in return for so much given. The bonds were breaking, and perhaps, in their breaking, there was finally room for something new to grow. My daughter returned after 4 days at Jessica's house, bringing with her shopping bags I knew I hadn't paid for, and an attitude that suggested her time away had only reinforced her disdain for our modest life. She dropped the bags in the hallway without explanation, didn't acknowledge my quiet, welcome home, and headed straight to her room as if I were merely part of the furniture, noticed only when out of place or malfunctioning. I picked up one of the bags that had fallen over, catching a glimpse of designer labels that made my stomach clench. Each item probably cost more than I made in a week. Jessica's family had money, the kind that came easily and was spent without thought, and I watched as my daughter absorbed their lifestyle like a sponge, returning to our apartment with barely concealed disgust at its inadequacy. "How was your stay?" I asked that evening when she emerged for dinner, trying to keep my voice light, trying to maintain the connection that felt more like a threadbare rope every day. She shrugged, scrolling through her phone while picking at the spaghetti I'd made. Her favorite once, or at least it used to be before my cooking became just another thing about me that disappointed her. Fine. Jessica's mom made reservations at that new French restaurant downtown. The one that just opened? The implication hung in the air. Jessica's mom took her somewhere special, somewhere I could never afford, somewhere that highlighted the vast difference between the life my daughter wanted and the life I could provide. "That sounds lovely," I said, swallowing the hurt along with a forkful of pasta that suddenly tasted like cardboard. It was. She didn't look up from her phone. Her mom's really cool. She's a lawyer, makes like 6 figures. "They're going to Paris this summer." Each word was a small blade, cutting with precision. I'd taken her to the beach once, when she was 7, driving 4 hours in my old car to spend a weekend in a cheap motel where we could hear the ocean if we opened the window. She'd loved it then, collected shells and built sandcastles, and told me I was the best mom in the world. Now, the memory felt like evidence of my inadequacy. A weekend at the beach when she could have had Paris. "Maybe someday we could take a trip too," I offered, knowing even as I said it how pathetic it sounded, how empty the promise was when I could barely afford her weekly allowance, let alone international travel. She looked up then, and the expression on her face made me wish she'd kept her eyes on her phone. It was pity mixed with contempt, the look you might give someone who didn't understand they were embarrassing themselves. "Mom, no offense, but I don't want to go on vacation with you. Like, even if you could afford it, which you can't, I'd rather go with people who are actually, you know." She waved her hand vaguely, searching for words that would hurt less than the ones she was thinking. "Fun, successful, not stuck in dead-end jobs complaining about money all the time." I felt something crack inside me, another small fracture in the foundation of who I thought I was. "I don't complain about money all the time," I said quietly, though even as I spoke I knew it was futile to defend myself. She'd already decided who I was, and nothing I said would change the narrative she'd constructed. Whatever. She returned to her phone, the conversation over in her mind. "Is there any dessert?" I shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. There was no dessert because I'd spent the grocery budget on her allowance last week, but explaining that would just prove her point about my constant focus on finances. She sighed dramatically, pushed her half-eaten plate away, and left the table without offering to help clean up. I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the congealing pasta, wondering when I'd become someone so easy to dismiss, so unworthy of basic courtesy. The following week brought my birthday, 53 years old, a number that felt simultaneously too young to give up and too old to start over. I didn't expect much. My birthdays had been quiet affairs for years, usually just a card from a few colleagues at work and maybe a small cake I bought for myself. But some small, hopeful part of me thought my daughter might remember, might acknowledge the day even if she couldn't bring herself to celebrate it. I woke up that morning to an empty apartment. She'd left early, unusual for someone who typically slept until noon on weekends. No note, no message, nothing to indicate she'd remembered what day it was. I made coffee in the silent kitchen and tried not to feel the weight of my own insignificance. At work, the residents and staff made a small fuss. Mrs. Chen had organized a cupcake in the break room, and several residents gave me cards they'd made themselves, their shaky handwriting spelling out birthday wishes with more warmth than I'd felt at home in years. I cried in the staff bathroom, overwhelmed by the realization that virtual strangers treated me with more affection than my own daughter. I came home that evening to find her in the living room with two of her friends, girls I'd met briefly over the years, but who looked through me as if I were invisible. They were laughing about something, sharing a bottle of wine I knew I hadn't bought and definitely hadn't given her permission to take from the cabinet where I kept the cheap bottle someone had gifted me years ago. "Oh, hey," my daughter said, glancing up with the casual indifference she'd perfected. "This is my mom. She just got home from work. Not, it's my mom's birthday. Not my mom who raised me alone and never missed a single one of my birthdays. Just a statement of fact, as unremarkable as commenting on the weather." "Hi, Mrs." one of the girls started, clearly not even knowing my last name. "Mariella," I said quietly. "Just Mariella." "Cool. Love what you've done with the place," the other girl said, and I couldn't tell if she was being sarcastic or genuinely couldn't see how shabby everything was. The worn furniture, the faded curtains, the carpet that had needed replacing for 5 years. I excused myself to my room, my birthday dinner plans of making something special reduced to eating a granola bar alone, while listening to my daughter laugh with people who mattered more to her than I did. I could hear them through the thin walls, talking about their lives, their plans, their futures that all seemed to involve prestigious colleges and exotic travel and opportunities I could never provide. "Is your mom always so quiet?" one of them asked, her voice carrying clearly. "She's just like that," my daughter replied. "Kind of, I don't know, she doesn't really have much going on. Works at a nursing home, comes home, watches TV. Pretty boring life, honestly." The words shouldn't have hurt as much as they did. I'd heard worse, endured more direct insults. But hearing myself reduced to such a simple, dismissive description, as if 23 years of single motherhood, of sacrifice and struggle and love, could be summarized as boring, that cut deeper than any of her angry outbursts. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling with its water stain that looked like a cloud, and tried to remember when I'd last felt seen. Really seen, not just glanced at or looked through, but truly recognized as a person with feelings, dreams, a history that mattered. The answer didn't come because the truth was too painful to acknowledge. I'd been invisible for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be visible. Later that night, after her friends had left and the apartment had fallen quiet again, I found a grocery receipt on the kitchen counter. My daughter had used my debit card, the one I'd given her for emergencies, to buy the wine and snacks for her gathering. $37 I hadn't budgeted for, taken without asking, spent without thought. I picked up the receipt, studied the items listed there, and felt something shift in me. Not anger exactly, though that was there too. Something colder, more calculated. I was tired of being the emergency fund for her social life, tired of being the invisible woman who existed only to serve, to provide, to fade into the background of her increasingly entitled existence. I thought about confronting her, demanding respect, setting boundaries that should have been established years ago, but I'd tried that before, in smaller ways, and it always ended the same, with her tears, her accusations that I was being unfair, her threats to move out if I didn't stop trying to control her life, and I'd always backed down because the thought of losing her completely was more terrifying than the slow erosion of being taken for granted. But now, holding that receipt in my hand on my 53rd birthday that she'd forgotten, I wondered if there was any difference between being taken for granted and being lost. Either way, I was alone. Either way, I was invisible. At least if she left, I wouldn't have to witness my own erasure every single day. I tucked the receipt in my wallet. Another piece of evidence in a case I was building without fully understanding why. Maybe I was documenting my own disappearance, creating a paper trail of all the ways I'd allowed myself to be diminished. Or maybe I was finally starting to see clearly, to recognize patterns I'd been too close to notice before. The next morning, I made breakfast for one. When my daughter emerged, expecting food to be waiting as it always was, she found me sitting at the table with my coffee and toast, nothing prepared for her. "What's for breakfast?" she asked, opening the refrigerator with the expectation of someone who'd never had to wonder if there would be food. "I'm not sure what you're planning," I said calmly, not looking up from the newspaper I was pretending to read. "I made what I wanted for myself." She stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. "Are you serious right now? You made breakfast and didn't make me anything?" "You're 23 years old," I said, still not meeting her eyes because I knew if I saw her face I might weaken, might fall back into the patterns that had brought us here. "You're capable of making your own breakfast." The silence that followed was heavy with shock and indignation. I could feel her processing this small rebellion, trying to decide if it was worth fighting about. Finally, she grabbed her purse and keys with exaggerated movements. "Fine, I'll get something on the way to Jessica's, since apparently my own mother can't even be bothered to feed me anymore." The door slammed behind her, and I sat in the resulting quiet, my hands shaking slightly around my coffee cup. It was such a small thing, not making breakfast, such a tiny act of self-preservation, but it felt enormous, like I'd crossed some invisible line that separated the Mariella who accepted everything from the Mariella who might finally be ready to ask for something in return. I finished my coffee slowly, savoring the silence that usually felt oppressive, but today felt almost peaceful. For the first time in years, I'd done something just for myself, made a choice that prioritized my own needs over her expectations. It was a small beginning, barely noticeable, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground at winter's end, but it was a beginning nonetheless. And as I washed my single plate and single cup, leaving the kitchen clean but empty of any evidence that I'd been anticipating her needs, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the faint stirring of my own voice, buried so long beneath the weight of motherhood and sacrifice, finally beginning to remember how to speak. I was still invisible in my own story, still the supporting character in my daughter's narrative, but maybe, just maybe, I was starting to understand that I didn't have to accept that role forever. Maybe there was still time to write myself back into my own life, to reclaim the visibility I'd surrendered so gradually I hadn't even noticed it disappearing. The day stretched ahead, full of work and routine and all the ordinary moments that made up a life. But something had shifted, some small internal rebellion that whispered, I didn't have to keep disappearing just to make room for someone who didn't even notice I was gone. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough to start the slow journey back to yourself. The weeks that followed my small breakfast rebellion brought a cold war to our apartment that chilled me more than any open conflict ever had. My daughter stopped speaking to me entirely unless absolutely necessary, communicating through terse text messages even when we were in the same room. "Need laundry detergent," she'd text from her bedroom while I sat 10 feet away in the living room. "When will you be home?" another message would read, as if the sound of my voice had become too unpleasant to endure. I told myself this was better than the constant criticism, the endless comparisons to Jessica's successful mother, the casual cruelty disguised as honesty. But the silence was its own form of torture, a reminder that I'd failed so completely at motherhood that even my presence had become unwelcome. I started coming home later from work, accepting extra shifts I didn't need just to avoid the apartment that had become a museum of my failures. Every room held evidence of a relationship that had slowly died, while I'd been too busy trying to save it to notice it was already gone. The kitchen where she wouldn't eat my cooking, The living room where she couldn't bear to watch television with me. The hallway where we passed each other like strangers, careful not to make eye contact, not to acknowledge the chasm that had opened between us. Mrs. Chen noticed my increased hours at Sunrise Senior Living. "Running from something, dear?" she asked one evening as I helped her prepare for bed, her wise eyes seeing far more than I wanted to reveal. "Just trying to keep busy," I lied, but my voice betrayed me with its emptiness. "The busiest people are often the loneliest," she said, patting my hand with her papery fingers. "Because if you stop moving, you have to feel what you've been running from." She was right, of course. As long as I kept moving, working, cleaning, organizing, helping others, I didn't have to sit with the devastating truth that I'd raised a child who couldn't stand me, that I'd poured everything I had into a relationship that had left me completely empty. One evening, I arrived home to find my daughter packing boxes in her room. My heart seized with a fear I immediately hated myself for feeling. She was leaving, finally doing what she'd threatened so many times. And I should have felt relief, but instead felt panic at the thought of losing even this cold, hostile version of her. "What are you doing?" I asked from her doorway, my voice smaller than I'd intended. She didn't look up. "Moving in with Jessica. Her family has a guest house. They said I could stay there." Of course they did. Jessica's family with their money and their French restaurants and their trips to Paris. They could afford to be generous, to take in strays, to be the hero in a story where I was the villain who'd failed to provide adequately. "When?" The word came out like a plea, and I hated myself for it. "This weekend." She folded a sweater with precise movements, still not meeting my eyes. "Jessica's brother is helping me move my stuff, not asking if I could help, not inviting me to be part of this transition, just informing me of a decision already made, a future already planned that didn't include me in any capacity. Will you come visit sometimes?" I asked, knowing I sounded desperate but unable to stop myself. This was my daughter, the baby I'd rocked through countless nights, the child I'd sacrificed everything for. Surely there was still something worth salvaging. She finally looked at me then, and the expression on her face was worse than anger or contempt. It was pity. "Mom, I think we both need space. This whole thing," she gestured vaguely between us, reducing 23 years to this whole thing. "It's not healthy, for either of us." I wanted to ask what she meant by not healthy. I wanted to know when loving someone with everything you had became toxic, when sacrifice became suffocation, when being a mother became a crime worthy of exile. But I didn't ask because I already knew the answer. I'd failed her by being exactly who I was: poor, ordinary, unremarkable, insufficient. That night, I sat at the kitchen table where I'd sat 1,000 times before, but this time I couldn't even pretend to be doing anything productive. No bills to pay, no meals to plan, no future to imagine because the future I'd been working toward had just announced it was moving to a guest house where I wasn't welcome. I pulled out my phone, the cheap replacement that had never felt like mine, and scrolled through the empty photo gallery. No memories, no moments captured, no evidence that I'd ever been someone worth documenting. On impulse, I opened my social media, something I rarely did because seeing other people's lives only reminded me how small mine had become. Jessica's mother had posted photos from their family dinner that week. I recognized the restaurant, the French place my daughter had mentioned, and there, in the background of one photo, I could see her, my daughter, laughing at something Jessica's mother had said, her face lit up with joy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The caption read, "So blessed to have such wonderful young women in our lives. Can't wait for our Paris adventure this summer." Paris. She was going to Paris with them, living with them, becoming part of their family while treating me like a shameful secret to be hidden away. I closed the app, set down the phone, and felt something inside me finally break. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming, but quietly, like old fabric that's been stretched too thin for too long, finally tearing under pressure that had become unbearable. I walked to my bedroom and opened my closet, looking at the clothes I'd worn for years, the same practical outfits chosen for durability rather than style. I pulled out the dress I'd bought for her high school graduation, the one nice thing I'd owned, purchased on sale but still expensive enough to make me skip meals for a week. I'd worn it once, Felt proud and pretty for one afternoon while watching my daughter receive her diploma. She'd complained that I looked embarrassing, that everyone else's mothers wore designer clothes, that I'd somehow ruined her special day by not being wealthy enough to blend in with the other parents. I laid the dress on my bed and stared at it, this symbol of every way I'd tried and failed to be enough. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back in the closet, and closed the door on it and everything it represented. The apartment was silent except for the sound of packing coming from my daughter's room. Each thud of items being placed in boxes felt like a countdown to my complete irrelevance. Soon, she'd be gone, and I'd be alone in this space that we'd shared, but never really inhabited together. Not for years. I thought about all the things I'd given up for her. The secretarial course that might have led to a better job. The kind man who'd wanted to date me when she was 10, but I'd refused because she'd cried when I tried to go out. The friendships I'd let fade because I'd been too tired from working and parenting to maintain them. The dreams I'd set aside. The ambitions I'd buried. The version of myself I'd sacrificed on the altar of motherhood. And for what? To raise a child so ashamed of me that she was moving in with virtual strangers, rather than share space with her own mother? I pulled out a notepad from my nightstand drawer. I'd always kept one there for grocery lists and reminders, and began to write. Not a letter to her. I was beyond that now. But a list of everything I'd lost in the process of becoming her mother. Every choice I'd made that had led me to this moment of complete isolation. The list grew longer than I'd expected. Education opportunities, career advancement, romantic relationships, friendships, hobbies, travel, financial security, self-respect, dignity, hope. That last word stared back at me from the page. Hope. When had I lost that? Not all at once, but gradually, like watching a candle burn down so slowly you don't notice, until suddenly, you're sitting in darkness. I tore the page from the notepad, folded it carefully, and placed it in my wallet next to the receipt from her unauthorized purchase on my birthday. Evidence, documentation, proof that I'd existed, that I'd given things up, that my life had meant something even if my daughter couldn't see it. Saturday came with the rumble of Jessica's brother's truck. I stayed in my room while they loaded boxes, unable to watch the systematic removal of my daughter from my life. I heard voices, laughter, the easy camaraderie of people who found each other's company pleasant. My daughter's voice rose above the others, lighter and happier than I'd heard it in months. She was relieved to be leaving. I could hear it in every word, every laugh, every instruction about which box held what. This wasn't a difficult goodbye for her. It was an escape. When the truck finally pulled away, she didn't knock on my door, didn't say goodbye. I heard the apartment door close, her footsteps fading down the hallway, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence that felt like the universe holding its breath, waiting to see if I'd survive this final abandonment. I emerged from my room to find the apartment transformed. Her room stood empty, closet doors hanging open to reveal nothing but wire hangers and dust. The bathroom we'd shared held only my toiletries now. The living room felt larger somehow, hollow, like a body missing vital organs. On the kitchen table I found a note. Not a letter, just a few words scrawled on a piece of paper torn from a magazine. Will text you my new address. Thanks for everything. A. Not love Amanda. Not your daughter. Just A. As if even signing her full name would have required more connection than she was willing to give. Thanks for everything. As if 23 years of single motherhood could be summarized with the same casual gratitude you'd offer someone who held a door open. I sat down at the empty table, the note in my hands, and felt the last vestiges of hope finally fall silent. There would be no reconciliation, no moment of understanding where she'd realize what I'd given up for her, no tearful apology or grateful acknowledgement. She was gone, and she was relieved to be gone. And that was the end of the story I'd been writing since the moment I'd first held her in my arms. The silence pressed against me from all sides, and I let it. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't do anything dramatic or cathartic. I just sat there, a 53-year-old woman alone in an apartment that had never really felt like home anyway, and accepted that this was my life now. But in that acceptance, in that moment of complete surrender to my circumstances, something small and unexpected stirred. Not hope. I was done with that. something else. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, being alone wasn't the same as being finished. Maybe I still had something left, something they'd all forgotten, something even I had forgotten in the years of giving everything away. I folded the note, placed it with the other documents in my wallet, and stood up from the table. Tomorrow I would figure out what came next. Tonight, I would simply sit in the quiet and remember who I'd been before I'd become someone's mother, someone's disappointment, someone's escape route. The first week alone in the apartment was disorienting. I kept expecting to hear her door slam, her voice complaining about something I'd failed to provide, the television blaring from her room at hours when normal people slept. Instead, there was only silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the hostile quiet of two people avoiding each other, but the open, breathing quiet of a space that belonged entirely to me. I found myself moving through the rooms differently, no longer tiptoeing to avoid disturbing her, no longer bracing for criticism about the way I arranged furniture or chose to spend my evening. On the third night, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, something I'd stopped doing years ago because she'd complained about the electricity bill while simultaneously leaving every device in her room plugged in and running. The light felt defiant somehow, each lamp a small declaration that I was allowed to see clearly in my own home. I started noticing things I'd stopped seeing, the crack in the ceiling I'd meant to repair 5 years ago. The bookshelf in the corner that still held books I'd loved before becoming a mother had consumed all my reading time. The window that faced east, letting in morning sun I'd forgotten was beautiful because I'd always been too rushed, too stressed, too focused on her needs to appreciate something as simple as light. At work, Mrs. Chen observed these small changes with her characteristic perception. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, as I helped her with her physical therapy exercises. "Lighter somehow, even though I suspect you're carrying the same weight." "My daughter moved out," I told her, and waited for the sympathy that usually followed such announcements. Instead, Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel about that?" It was a question no one else had asked. My coworkers had offered condolences, as if I'd experienced a death. My supervisor had suggested I take a few days off if I needed time to adjust. Everyone assumed I was devastated, and I'd let them assume it because admitting the truth felt like betraying some fundamental code of motherhood. But Mrs. Chen wasn't asking what I should feel. She was asking what I actually felt. I paused, searching for honesty in the rubble of everything I'd been told I should experience. "I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years. And that makes me feel guilty, which makes me feel angry, which makes me feel confused about who I even am anymore." Mrs. Chen smiled, the kind of smile that came from recognizing your own past in someone else's present. "Good. Confusion means you're starting to wake up. For so long, you knew exactly who you were. Her mother, her provider, her disappointment. Now you have the chance to remember who Mariella is." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple I couldn't remember noticing in months. Who was Mariella? Not Mariella the mother, not Mariella the nurse's aide, not Mariella the woman who wasn't good enough. Just Mariella. I pulled over at a small park I passed every day on my commute, a green space I'd never actually entered despite driving by it hundreds of times. I sat on a bench near a playground where children were playing, their laughter mixing with the evening bird song, and I tried to remember. Before Amanda was born, I'd wanted to write. Nothing grand or ambitious, just small stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments. I'd filled notebooks with observations and character sketches, fragments of dialogue and descriptions of the world as I saw it. I'd even enrolled in a creative writing class at the community college, attended 3 sessions before discovering I was pregnant, and everything else became secondary to the reality growing inside me. When had I last written anything that wasn't a grocery list or a schedule? When had I last allowed myself to observe the world with the kind of attention that turned everyday moments into stories worth telling? I pulled out my phone, the cheap replacement that had never felt entirely mine, and opened the Notes app. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain, like a musician returning to an instrument after years of silence. Then slowly I began to type. There are many ways to become invisible. You can fade gradually, like old photographs left in sunlight. Or you can be erased deliberately, painted over by people who need the space you occupy for their own expanding lives. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, as if some long-blocked channel was finally clearing. I wrote about the phone being crushed, about birthday forgotten, about moving boxes and empty rooms, and the particular pain of being replaced by strangers who could afford to be generous. I wrote until the sun had fully set and the playground had emptied, until my fingers cramped and the streetlights flickered on around me. When I finally stopped, I had 3 pages of raw, unpolished prose that captured something true about my experience. It wasn't great writing. I was too rusty, too unpracticed, but it was mine. For the first time in 23 years, I'd created something that existed solely for me, that didn't serve anyone else's needs or expectations. I saved the document, titled simply Invisible, and drove home feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of possibility that had been absent for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like. The apartment was still empty when I arrived, but it felt less oppressive now. I made myself dinner, actual dinner, not the quick, forgettable meals I'd eaten standing at the counter for years, and sat at the table with a book I'd been meaning to read. No television for background noise, no rushing through the meal to avoid confrontation, just me and food and words on a page. It was so quiet I could hear my own thoughts, and for the first time in years, they weren't entirely critical. Over the following days, I started making small changes. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, putting the couch where I wanted it, not where Amanda had insisted it should go to optimize her television viewing. I bought fresh flowers from the grocery store, something I'd always considered too frivolous, too expensive, too much of an indulgence when there were practical needs to meet. I placed them on the kitchen table, and every time I saw them, I remembered that I was allowed to have beautiful things, that my life didn't have to be entirely functional and self-denying. I started attending a free writing workshop at the library on Thursday evenings. The first session was terrifying. I almost turned around in the parking lot, convinced I didn't belong among people who had the confidence to call themselves writers. But I forced myself to walk through the doors, to sit in the circle of folding chairs, to introduce myself to strangers who didn't know me as anyone's mother or anyone's disappointment. "I'm Mariella," I said when my turn came. "I used to write, a long time ago. I'm trying to remember how." The group leader, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled at me. "Welcome back to yourself," she said, and something about the phrasing made my throat tight with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Each week, I brought new pieces of writing, fragments of memory, observations about the nursing home residents, small fictions about people I imagined in the coffee shop or the park. The other writers offered feedback that was honest but encouraging, and slowly, I began to trust my own voice again, to believe that what I had to say might actually matter to someone, even if that someone was just me. Amanda didn't text. Days turned into weeks with no contact, no questions about how I was managing, no acknowledgement that I existed beyond being the person who might send money if asked. I told myself I didn't care, that her silence was actually a gift. It freed me from the constant anxiety of wondering what I'd done wrong, what new disappointment I'd delivered. But late at night, alone in the too quiet apartment, I still felt the ache of her absence. Not the absence of who she'd become, but the absence of who I'd hoped she'd be, the daughter I'd imagined while rocking her as an infant, the relationship I'd believed we were building with every sacrifice I made. Grief, I was learning, wasn't just about death. It was about the death of expectations, the burial of futures you'd planned that would never come to pass. I was grieving the daughter I'd never actually had, the relationship that had existed only in my hopeful imagination. Mrs. Chen helped me understand this one evening as I shared my conflicted feelings. "You're mourning 2 losses," she said gently. "The daughter you raised and the mother you had to be to raise her. Both of those people are gone now. The question is, who gets to emerge from their absence? Who indeed?" I was 53 years old, starting over in ways I'd never anticipated. My savings account was still nearly empty. Amanda moving out hadn't magically improved my finances. I still worked the same job, still struggled to make ends meet, still drove the same old car, and lived in the same modest apartment. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, wasn't just enduring until some future moment when things might improve. I was living, actively and intentionally, making choices that served my own growth rather than someone else's comfort. I joined a book club at the library. I started taking walks in the park where I'd written those first words, observing the changing seasons with the attention of someone who'd forgotten that beauty existed in ordinary moments. I reconnected with an old friend from my pre-motherhood days, nervously reaching out after years of silence. "Mariella," she'd exclaimed when she answered my call. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared entirely." "I had," I admitted, "but I'm trying to come back." We met for coffee, and she didn't judge me for the years of absence, didn't demand explanations for why I'd let our friendship lapse. She just welcomed me back into her life with the kind of grace I was learning to offer myself, acceptance of the past without letting it dictate the future. Through these small acts of reclamation, I began to understand what Mrs. Chen had meant about waking up. For years I'd been sleepwalking through my life, operating on autopilot while my sense of self slowly eroded. Now, I was deliberately present, consciously choosing how to spend my time, my energy, my limited resources. It wasn't dramatic or revolutionary. I wasn't becoming a different person or achieving some grand transformation. I was simply remembering who I'd been before I'd sacrificed everything on the altar of motherhood, and discovering that maybe, just maybe, that person was still worth knowing. The writing became my anchor, the thing I did for myself that had nothing to do with earning money or meeting obligations or proving my worth to anyone else. Every Thursday evening at the workshop, every quiet moment at home with my notebook, every observation I captured in words, these were acts of self-preservation, evidence that I existed beyond my roles and relationships. One evening, the workshop leader asked us to write about a moment of transformation. I found myself writing about the crushed phone, about standing in my kitchen and seeing my broken reflection in the shattered screen. But this time, I wrote it differently. This time, the broken phone became a metaphor for everything that had needed to break, so something new could emerge. Sometimes, I wrote, we have to be shattered completely before we can be reassembled into something stronger, something that belongs entirely to ourselves. When I read it aloud to the group, I felt the truth of those words resonating in my chest. I had been shattered, but I wasn't finished. I was just beginning to understand that the pieces of myself I'd thought were lost had simply been waiting for permission to come back together in a new configuration. It wasn't revenge I was seeking. It wasn't even reconciliation. It was something simpler and more profound. Reclamation. I was taking back my life, my identity, my right to exist as more than someone's disappointment. And in that reclamation, I was discovering something Amanda had failed to understand. I had always been something better. I'd just forgotten to look for it in myself. 3 months passed without a word from Amanda. 3 months of silence that gradually transformed from painful to peaceful, from abandonment to liberation. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped wondering if today would be the day she'd remember I existed. Instead, I filled my days with the quiet work of rebuilding a self I'd almost forgotten. The writing workshop had become the highlight of my week. I'd progressed from tentative fragments to complete stories, small narratives about resilience and survival that seemed to resonate with the other participants. One evening, our instructor, Margaret, pulled me aside after class. "Mariella, have you ever considered submitting your work for publication?" she asked, holding the latest piece I'd shared. A story about a woman who discovered her worth after being discarded. I laughed, the sound uncomfortable in my throat. "Oh, I don't think I'm good enough for that. These are just therapy exercises, really." Margaret's expression became serious. "That's exactly what your daughter trained you to believe, isn't it? That you're not good enough? That your dreams are just foolish distractions?" She placed her hand on my arm. "You have a voice, Mariella. A real one. Don't silence it just because someone taught you that you don't deserve to be heard." Her words haunted me on the drive home. How many times had I dismissed my own abilities, my own worth, because Amanda's contempt had become the lens through which I viewed myself? How many opportunities had I missed because I'd internalized her message that I was ordinary, boring, insufficient? That night, I stayed up late researching literary magazines that accepted submissions. The process felt presumptuous, almost rebellious. Who was I to think strangers might want to read my words? But I remembered Margaret's challenge and pushed through the discomfort. I selected my strongest piece, the one about the shattered phone and broken reflections, and with trembling fingers, I submitted it to a small online magazine that published stories about women's experiences. The act felt significant beyond its practical reality, a declaration that my voice mattered even if my own daughter couldn't hear it. Life at the nursing home had also shifted in unexpected ways. Mrs. Chen, noticing my growing confidence, had started introducing me to her visitors with pride rather than simple courtesy. "This is Mariella," she'd say to her grandson or her old colleagues. "She's a wonderful writer, very talented. You should hear her stories." The praise embarrassed me at first, felt undeserved and excessive, but gradually, I began to accept it, to recognize that maybe, just maybe, I did have something valuable to offer beyond my ability to provide physical care or financial support. One afternoon, as I was helping Mr. Rodriguez with his lunch, he asked about my daughter. It was the first time anyone at work had mentioned her since she'd left, and I found myself answering honestly instead of deflecting. "We're not in contact right now," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "She needed space, and I'm learning to give it to her." "Space," Mr. Rodriguez repeated thoughtfully, his weathered hand steady on his water glass. "That's what my son said too, 30 years ago. Needed space. You know when he came back? He looked at me directly. When he needed money, when his business failed and his wife left him, and suddenly, the old man he'd been too sophisticated to visit became useful again." "What did you do?" I asked, curious despite myself. "I helped him," Mr. Rodriguez said, "but differently than he expected. Didn't just hand him money. Made him work for it, here in my shop. Made him spend time with me, talk to me. Remember I was human." He smiled slightly. "Took him 6 months to understand what I was doing. Teaching him that relationships aren't ATM machines. That love requires presence, not just transactions." His words stayed with me, planting seeds of something I wasn't quite ready to name. Not revenge. I'd moved beyond that. But perhaps a quiet form of justice, a rebalancing of power that didn't require cruelty, just clarity. The following week brought an unexpected email. The literary magazine had accepted my story. They wanted to publish it in their next issue, and while there was no payment, it was a volunteer-run publication. They offered something more valuable, validation that my voice deserved to be heard. I read the acceptance email 3 times, unable to believe it was real. Margaret had been right. I did have something worth sharing. All those years I'd spent believing I was ordinary and unremarkable had been based on one person's assessment, and that person had been wrong. I printed the email and placed it in a folder I'd started keeping, a collection of evidence that I was more than I'd been allowed to believe. The writing workshop certificates, positive feedback from other participants, now this acceptance letter, physical proof that Mariella the writer existed, that she had value, that she mattered. Around this time, something else began to happen. Small things at first, barely noticeable. A text from Amanda asking if I still had her old textbooks. She needed them for a friend. Not, "How are you?" or, "I've been thinking about you." Just a transactional request as if I were a storage facility rather than her mother. I responded simply, "I donated them to the library. You said you didn't want them anymore." Her reply came quickly. "Seriously? Those were expensive." I didn't respond. For the first time, I recognized her pattern. Reaching out only when she wanted something, framing her needs as my obligations. And for the first time, I felt no compulsion to apologize for not being psychic, for not preserving everything she'd discarded just in case she might someday want it back. A week later, another text. "Jessica's family is going through some stuff. Might need to find a new place soon. What's rent on the apartment?" Not, "Can I come home?" Not, "I miss you." Just a calculation. An assessment of her options where I ranked somewhere below Jessica's family, but above complete strangers. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the old familiar tug of motherly obligation warring with something newer, stronger, self-preservation. The old Mariella would have immediately offered to let her move back, would have welcomed her with open arms despite everything, grateful just to have her daughter nearby again. But I wasn't that Mariella anymore. "I've converted your room into a writing space," I typed back, "but I can help you look for apartments if you'd like." The silence that followed was different from her previous silences. This wasn't indifference or contempt. This was shock. I'd violated the unspoken agreement of our relationship, that I would always be available, always accommodate her needs, always prioritize her comfort over my own. I had claimed her room. I had established boundaries. I had, for perhaps the first time in her life, chosen myself over her expectations. In truth, I hadn't fully converted her room yet. It still held her old furniture, still smelled faintly of her perfume. But I'd placed my desk there, my notebooks and pens, the bulletin board where I pinned story ideas and inspirational quotes. I'd begun the transformation, and her text had simply forced me to commit to it completely. That weekend, I finished what I'd started. I donated her furniture to a local charity, painted the walls a soft blue that made me think of clear skies and open possibilities. I arranged my writing space with care, desk by the window where morning light streamed in, bookshelves for the volumes I was slowly accumulating, a comfortable chair where I could read and think and simply be. The room transformed from a shrine to her absence into a temple of my presence. Every choice was mine. The colors, the arrangement, the purpose. This was Mariella's space, not Amanda's old bedroom waiting in suspended animation for her possible return. My friend Lisa visited and stood in the doorway of my new writing room, taking in the changes with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is incredible, Mariella," she finally said. "You've really claimed this space for yourself." "It felt necessary," I admitted, "like I needed to make it physical, to prove that I'm allowed to take up room in my own life." Lisa hugged me then and whispered, "You were always allowed. You just needed to give yourself permission." At the next writing workshop, I shared a new piece, a story about a mother who discovers that the greatest gift she can give her adult child is the example of a woman who knows her own worth. Margaret smiled when I finished reading, and several other participants wiped their eyes. "That's your truth, isn't it?" Margaret asked gently. "You're teaching her something, even in her absence." I nodded, understanding for the first time that this journey wasn't about punishing Amanda or proving her wrong. It was about showing her, and myself, that love doesn't require self-erasure, that being a good mother doesn't mean being no one at all. Amanda's next text came 2 days later. "Can we talk?" I looked at those 3 words and felt nothing but calm. Not eagerness, not dread, just a quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would face it as someone who knew her own value, someone who had rediscovered her voice and wouldn't easily silence it again. "Of course," I replied. "Let me know when works for you." But I didn't sit by the phone waiting for her response. I didn't rearrange my schedule or cancel my writing workshop or spend hours preparing what I'd say. I simply continued living my life, this new life I was building one small choice at a time, because I'd learned something crucial in her absence. I didn't need her validation to know I mattered. I didn't need her recognition to know I had worth. I didn't need her love to know I was lovable. I had found something better than her approval. I'd found myself, and that discovery had changed everything. Amanda arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, her appearance carefully calculated. Not the designer clothes she'd paraded around in before, but simpler attire that suggested humility she may or may not have felt. I watched from the window as she sat in her car for several minutes, gathering courage or perhaps rehearsing whatever speech she'd prepared. I'd spent the morning writing, as had become my habit, and I didn't rush to put away my notebook or hide the evidence of my new life. When she finally knocked, I took my time walking to the door, no longer conditioned to drop everything the moment she demanded my attention. "Hi, Mom," she said when I opened it, and I noticed immediately how the word sounded, uncertain, almost like a question, as if she wasn't sure she still had the right to claim that relationship. "Amanda, come in." I stepped aside, watching her enter the apartment she'd abandoned 4 months ago. She looked around, taking in the changes. The furniture rearranged to suit my preferences. The fresh flowers on the table, lilies this week, because I'd learned I loved their scent. The book stacked beside my favorite chair, evidence of a life being actively lived rather than simply endured. "The place looks different," she said, and I couldn't tell if she approved or resented the transformation. "I made some changes." "Coffee?" I moved toward the kitchen without waiting for her answer, comfortable in my own space in a way I'd never been when she lived here. She followed, and I saw her pause at the doorway to what had been her room. Through the open door, my writing desk was clearly visible. My computer, the bulletin board covered with story notes and inspiration. "You really did turn my room into an office," she said, and something in her voice suggested she'd half believed I was bluffing. "Writing room," I corrected gently. "I've been working on some pieces. Actually had one published recently." "Published?" She turned to look at me, genuine surprise in her expression. "Like, in a real magazine?" "A small literary journal. Online. No payment. But yes, real publication." I poured coffee into 2 mugs. One my favorite, one a plain spare I kept for guests. I didn't offer her the mug that had once been designated as hers. I'd donated it along with everything else that had belonged to the version of us that no longer existed. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd demanded allowances and criticized my inadequacies, but the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't hovering anxiously, wasn't bracing for criticism. I simply sat, comfortable in my own skin, waiting for her to explain why she'd asked to talk. "Things didn't work out at Jessica's," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Her family, they're going through a divorce. It got ugly. Her mom asked me to leave." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not sorry that she'd lost her upgraded living situation, but genuinely sorry that she'd witnessed family dysfunction, that she'd been displaced again. "I thought maybe—" She hesitated, and I saw the calculation in her eyes, the assessment of how much vulnerability to show. "I thought maybe I could move back here, just temporarily until I figure things out." There it was, the real reason for her visit, the need that had motivated her to reach out after months of silence. I took a sip of my coffee, let the moment stretch, watched her squirm slightly in the discomfort of not getting an immediate yes. "The room is my writing space now," I said calmly. "As I mentioned, you could put a bed in there too, couldn't you? Or I could sleep on the couch, just for a little while." Her voice carried an edge of desperation that would have moved me 4 months ago, that would have had me immediately accommodating her needs at the expense of my own. "No," I said simply. The word hung between us, small but absolute. I watched emotions flicker across her face, shock, disbelief, then the familiar anger that had always worked to manipulate me before. "No? Are you serious? I'm your daughter. I need help. And you're just going to say no? I am your daughter, and I need help," I repeated, hearing the entitlement in her phrasing that she couldn't hear herself. "Not Mom. I'd really appreciate it if you could help me. Not, I understand I haven't been in touch, but I'm hoping we could work something out. Just the assumption that I exist to solve your problems." Her face flushed. "I didn't mean it like that." "Didn't you?" I kept my voice gentle but firm. "Amanda, when was the last time you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you contacted me for any reason other than needing something?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I've been dealing with a lot. I'm sure you have. We all deal with things. But relationships require more than just showing up when you need something. So you're punishing me? Is that what this is?" Her voice rose, the familiar pattern of making herself the victim when confronted with her own behavior. "I'm not punishing you. I'm taking care of myself. There's a difference." I stood up, walked to my wallet, and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping. The crushed phone receipt, the birthday note she'd forgotten, the documentation of her unauthorized purchases, the cold goodbye note she'd left. I spread them on the table between us, these artifacts of my erasure. "Do you remember any of these moments?" I asked quietly. "The phone you destroyed because I forgot your allowance once? The birthday you didn't acknowledge? The money you took without asking? The thanks for everything note you left like I was a hotel you'd checked out of?" She stared at the items, her face paling. I was going through stuff too, you know. You don't understand the pressure I was under." "You're right. I don't understand. Because you never told me. You never talked to me like I was a person who might care about your struggles. You just treated me like an ATM that occasionally malfunctioned. That's not fair, isn't it? I gathered the papers back together, returned them to my wallet. Amanda, I have spent 23 years putting you first. I gave up education, career opportunities, relationships, dreams, everything to make sure you had what you needed. And somehow, all that sacrifice taught you that I didn't matter, that my feelings, my needs, my entire existence was secondary to yours. Tears started falling down her face, and I felt the familiar tug to comfort her, to make it better, to take back my words and absorb her pain as I'd always done. But I stayed seated, stayed calm, let her feel the discomfort of accountability. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know you felt that way. You didn't know because you never asked, because it never occurred to you that I might have feelings that mattered. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so young it reminded me of the child she'd been, before entitlement and resentment had hardened her heart. So what now? You just don't want me in your life anymore? I didn't say that. I reached across the table, not to hold her hand, but to make sure she was looking at me when I spoke. I will always love you, Amanda. You're my daughter. But I won't go back to being invisible. I won't erase myself so you can take up all the space. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be real. It has to include respect, consideration, actual care for my well-being. I do care. Then show me. Not by asking to move back in when you're desperate. Not by needing things from me. But by being genuinely interested in my life. By respecting my boundaries. By acknowledging that I'm a person, not just your mother. She was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be different. Neither do I admitted. I'm learning too. Learning how to be Mariella, not just your mom. Learning that I'm allowed to have needs and dreams and a life that doesn't revolve around you. Like the writing, she said, glancing toward my office. Like the writing, and my workshop, and my friendships, and the flowers I buy myself every week because they make me happy. She looked at the lilies on the table as if seeing them for the first time. They're beautiful. They are. And I deserve beautiful things, Amanda. Even if I'm not rich. Even if I work as a nurse's aide. Even if I couldn't give you everything Jessica's family could. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. I was awful to you about that, wasn't I? About not having money. Yes, you were. You made me feel ashamed of circumstances largely beyond my control. You made me feel like my worth was tied to my bank balance. I'm sorry. The words came out raw, unpolished, and for the first time they sounded genuine rather than strategic. I appreciate that. But sorry isn't enough. Not anymore. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it requires action. It requires you to actually change how you treat me. I want to try, she said, and I heard uncertainty in her voice, the fear that she might not be capable of what I was asking. Then try, but not by moving back in, not by falling back into old patterns where I take care of everything and you take me for granted. Then how? I thought about Mr. Rodriguez and his son, about making someone work for reconciliation, about teaching through presence rather than transactions. Start by having coffee with me, once a week. No asking for things, no crisis that needs solving, just conversation. Let's learn to be two people who care about each other, not a mother and daughter stuck in toxic patterns. She nodded slowly. I can do that, I think. And Amanda, I'll help you find an apartment. I'll give you advice, support, encouragement. But I won't give you money. I won't let you move in. I won't sacrifice my space and peace and growth to make things easier for you. You're 23. It's time you learn to stand on your own feet. Her face showed the struggle, wanting to argue, to demand, to fall back on the old dynamics where her needs trumped everything. But she swallowed whatever protest she'd been forming, and just nodded. Okay, she whispered. Okay. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything said and unsaid settling between us. This wasn't a happy reunion. It wasn't a tearful reconciliation where everything was magically healed. It was something harder, more real. two people beginning the difficult work of building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation and resentment. When she left, she hugged me at the door, and it felt different from any embrace we'd shared before. Less desperate, less performative, more genuine. "Thursday?" she asked. "For coffee?" "Thursday works," I confirmed. I watched her walk to her car, no longer the confident young woman who'd destroyed my phone and crushed my spirit, but not yet whoever she might become if she chose to do the work. She was uncertain, humbled, forced to confront the consequences of her own behavior. And I was no longer the invisible woman who'd stood in that same kitchen 4 months ago, watching her reflection break in a shattered screen. I was Mariella, writer, friend, woman who knew her worth. The day had changed everything, but not through dramatic confrontation or righteous anger. Through quiet truth-telling, through boundaries held with love, through the simple act of refusing to disappear anymore. I closed the door and returned to my writing room, to the story I'd been working on before she arrived. The words flowed easily now, fueled by the clarity that comes from finally speaking your truth. Justice, I was learning, didn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looked like a woman reclaiming her voice and teaching others to hear it. 6 months later, I sat in my writing room, my room, claimed and cherished, putting the final touches on a story collection I'd never imagined I'd complete. The morning light filtered through curtains I'd chosen myself, casting gentle shadows across pages that held my truth in words I'd fought to reclaim. The Thursday coffee meetings with Amanda had continued, awkward at first, then gradually easier as we learned to talk to each other as people, rather than as roles we'd been trapped in. She didn't always understand my boundaries. Sometimes she still slipped into old patterns, asking for things with the assumption I'd provide them. But now I could say no without guilt, could redirect her toward her own solutions without feeling like I'd failed as a mother. "How's the job search going?" I asked during our most recent coffee date, genuinely curious rather than probing for problems to solve. "Actually, I got hired at a marketing firm. It's entry level, doesn't pay great, but it's something." She stirred her latte, and I noticed she'd started paying for our coffees, alternating weeks with me. Small gesture, significant meaning. "That's wonderful, Amanda." "Really? I found an apartment too. Well, a studio. It's tiny, and the neighborhood isn't great, but it's mine." She looked up at me, and I saw something new in her expression. Not pride exactly, but the beginning of self-respect that comes from standing on your own feet. "I've never had my own place before. Always went from your apartment to Jessica's house to, well, here we are. How does it feel?" I asked. She considered the question seriously. "Scary, lonely sometimes, but also good. Like I'm finally figuring out who I am when I'm not depending on someone else." I smiled, understanding that feeling intimately. "That's exactly it. That's exactly what you're supposed to be learning." We talked about her new job, her tiny studio, the challenges of budgeting when you're responsible for everything yourself. She didn't ask for money, didn't hint that I should help beyond the advice I freely offered. She was learning, slowly, what I'd had to learn much later in life, that dependence and love weren't the same thing. "Mom," she said as we were preparing to leave, "I've been thinking about everything that happened. The phone, the things I said, how I treated you." She paused, gathering courage. "I was really awful, and I'm not just saying that because you called me out on it. I'm saying it because I've been living on my own, struggling with my own stuff, and I keep thinking about how you did this alone with a kid to take care of, and I was so cruel about it." "Yes, you were," I agreed. Not to punish, but to validate what we both knew was true. "I don't know how to make it up to you." "You don't make it up to me, Amanda. You just do better going forward. You keep showing up for these coffees. You keep working on being someone who sees other people as human. You keep growing." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm trying. I really am. I know you are. And that matters more than you realize." At work, Mrs. Chen had become one of my biggest cheerleaders, celebrating each small milestone in my writing journey as if it were her own achievement. When I told her about the story collection I'd finished, she clasped her hands together with delight. "You must publish it properly, Mariella. Not just online. A real book." "I don't know about that," I demurred. But even as I said it, I knew I'd already started researching small presses, had already begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, my voice deserved that kind of platform. "Do you know what I love most about your transformation?" Mrs. Chen asked one afternoon as I helped her with her exercises. "It's not just that you found yourself again. It's that you did it without becoming bitter. You could have turned hard, resentful, angry at the world. Instead, you turned soft in all the right places. Soft toward yourself, soft toward possibility, soft enough to still love your daughter while being firm enough to demand respect." Her words stayed with me because they captured something essential about my journey. I hadn't become someone new. I'd become someone true, the person I'd always been underneath the layers of self-sacrifice and silent suffering. The writing workshop celebrated when my story collection was accepted by a small independent press. No advance, minimal distribution, but a real book with my name on it. Margaret hugged me, and several other participants clapped, and I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before. Not for what I could provide or how I could serve, but for what I'd created from my own pain and growth. "What will you call it?" Lisa asked when I told her the news over dinner. A ritual we'd established, taking turns trying new restaurants and talking about our lives like the friends we'd become again. "The weight of invisible things," I said. "It's about all the burdens we carry that no one else can see, the sacrifices that go unacknowledged, the slow erasure of self that happens when you love someone who can't see you." "It's perfect," she said. "And Mariella, I'm so proud of you. Not just for the book, but for everything. For surviving, for rebuilding, for refusing to stay broken." 3 months before the book's publication, Amanda asked if we could have dinner at my apartment instead of our usual coffee shop meeting. I agreed, curious about this change in routine. She arrived with groceries, ingredients for the spaghetti I used to make, the meal she'd once picked at with disdain. "I thought maybe I could cook for you," she said hesitantly. "I've been practicing. It's probably not as good as yours, but—" I watched her move around my kitchen, this young woman who was finally learning what it meant to give, rather than just receive. The meal was overcooked, the sauce too salty, but I ate every bite because it wasn't about the food. It was about the effort, the intention, the attempt to show love through action rather than just words. After dinner, we sat on my couch, the one I'd rearranged to face the window, the one that had never been quite comfortable when positioned for her preferences, and she pulled out a wrapped package. "I know it's not your birthday or anything," she said, handing it to me, "but I wanted you to have this." Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before, the two of us from her high school graduation, the day I'd worn the dress that embarrassed her. But someone had captured a moment I didn't remember, when she was looking at me with something that might have been love, before self-consciousness made her push me away. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "I found it when I was going through old stuff. I'd forgotten this moment, forgotten that I used to look at you like that, like you mattered." She wiped her eyes. "I want to learn to look at you like that again, really see you. Not just when I need something, but because you deserve to be seen." I held the frame, studying the faces of who we'd been, a mother proud of her daughter, a daughter not yet hardened by entitlement and disappointment. "We can't go back to this moment, Amanda. That version of us doesn't exist anymore." "I know, but maybe we can build something new, something better even, where we both see each other." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. The book launched quietly, the way most small press books do. A handful of reviews, a small reading at the local library, online sales that would never make me rich, but proved that my words resonated with people who'd experienced similar struggles. But the real success came in unexpected ways. Women approached me after readings, sharing their own stories of erasure and reclamation. Mothers and daughters brought copies to sign, whispering that the book had helped them start difficult conversations. Mrs. Chen displayed a copy proudly in her room at the nursing home, showing it to every visitor and explaining that this was her friend Mariella, who'd found her voice. Amanda came to my book launch, sat in the front row, and when I read the dedication, "For everyone who has ever had to remember they exist beyond the roles they've been assigned," she cried openly. Afterward, she bought 3 copies, one to keep, one to give to Jessica. They'd reconnected, their friendship now on more equal footing, and one she said was for her future self, to remember what she'd learned. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, hugging me after the reading. "Really proud. Not just because of the book, but because of who you've become, who you always were, underneath everything." Standing in that library, holding my published book, surrounded by people who'd taken the time to hear my story, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, standing in her kitchen, holding the pieces of a broken phone, wondering if there was anything left of herself worth salvaging. I'd found my answer, not in grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but in the quiet accumulation of small choices: choosing to write instead of watching TV, choosing to buy flowers instead of feeling guilty about the expense, choosing to say no when yes would have erased me further, choosing to believe that my voice mattered even when the person I'd loved most couldn't hear it. The relationship with Amanda would always be complicated, always require work. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But we were building something new, something based on mutual respect rather than obligation and resentment. She was learning to stand on her own, and I was learning to let her, not because I'd given up on her, but because I'd finally stopped giving up on myself. Mrs. Chen's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the example of a person who knows their worth. I'd given Amanda that gift, not through lectures or ultimatums, but by living it. By showing her that it was never too late to reclaim yourself, to remember your value, to refuse to stay invisible. "You taught me to remember," my daughter had said that day in the kitchen, crushing my phone beneath her heel. She'd meant it as a threat, as a lesson in consequences, but she'd been right in ways she couldn't have imagined. I had remembered. I'd remembered who I was before I became someone's mother, someone's disappointment, someone's ATM machine. I'd remembered that I had a voice worth hearing, a story worth telling, a self worth preserving. And in that remembering, I'd found something she'd told me to find, something better. Not a better daughter, not a better life, not a better version of the relationship we'd had, but a better version of myself. The Mariella who wrote stories and bought flowers and said no without guilt. The Mariella who could love her daughter while also loving herself. The Mariella who'd learned that you can't pour from an empty cup, and that filling your own cup first isn't selfish, it's survival. I looked around the library at the faces of women who understood, who'd lived their own versions of erasure and reclamation, and I smiled. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply refusing to disappear. It's finding your voice and using it. It's remembering that you exist beyond other people's perceptions of you. It's becoming visible again, even if only to yourself. And that visibility, that reclamation, that quiet revolution of self-worth, that was justice enough. That was everything. I was Mariella. I was a writer, a friend, a mother, a woman who'd been broken and rebuilt herself into something stronger. I was someone who mattered, and I would never forget that again.